The night I died, my fiancé raised a toast to my grandfather's fortune with the cousin who'd forged my signature onto a will amendment. 2 days after they buried me in a casket I never got to choose. I opened my eyes gasping, 10 years old again, lake water burning my lungs, my cousin's small hand slipping out of mine in Marblehead Harbor on July 19, 2000. I let her sink for 4 extra seconds than the first version of that day ever allowed, because in my first life, that same hand had signed away everything I owned. My name is Vivian Ashford. In my first life, I was 34 years old, a senior underwriter at Kestrel Mutual in Boston, engaged to a corporate attorney named Marcus Kane, and the presumed heir to my grandfather Elias Ashford's textile fortune, $86 million, 3 mills in New Hampshire, and a controlling stake in Ashford Weave Group. I found out I was none of those things on a Tuesday in October, 6 days before my wedding, when I came home early from a client dinner and found Marcus in my own apartment on Beacon Hill with my cousin Dahlia Voss, a bottle of Veuve Clicquot open between them, and a manila folder on my kitchen counter with my grandfather's estate seal on it. Dahlia had always been prettier than me, and louder, and better at making our family believe she was the wounded one. Growing up, she was Aunt Renata's golden girl, dressed in Neiman Marcus while I wore my mother's hand-me-downs, because my mother, Eleanor, had married a schoolteacher instead of old money and never let anyone forget the sacrifice. I loved Dahlia anyway. I defended her at every Thanksgiving when my mother called her spoiled. I lent her $40,000 in 2019 to cover a gallery she opened in the seaport and never once asked for it back in writing, because she was my cousin, and family didn't need contracts. That folder on my counter was an amendment to my grandfather's trust, dated 3 weeks earlier, moving 40% of my future voting shares into a Voss family holding company that Marcus had helped Dahlia incorporate in Delaware. My grandfather's real signature was on it. My grandfather, by then 81 and slipping in and out of dementia at Windrose Assisted Living in Marblehead, had signed a dozen documents that autumn without reading a single one, because Dahlia visited him every Sunday with lemon cake and told him I was too busy for him. Marcus had drafted the language. Marcus had notarized it through a colleague who owed him a favor. And Marcus, when I stood in my own kitchen and asked him to explain the champagne, the folder, and the fact that his shirt was on the back of my chair, told me the truth with a calm I still remember better than his face. "You were always going to inherit too much for one person to handle, Viv," he said. "Dahlia needed it more." I called off the wedding. I hired a lawyer. 3 weeks later my car went off Route 127 outside Manchester by the Sea at 11 at night, and the medical examiner ruled it a single-vehicle accident, possible suicide given the recent broken engagement and reported stress. Nobody looked hard at the brake line. Nobody looked hard at anything, because Marcus Kane sat in the front row at my funeral holding my Aunt Renata's hand, and Dahlia wore my grandmother's sapphire ring to the reception afterward and told people I would have wanted her to have it. That was the last thing I knew before the water closed over my head and I was 10 years old again, kicking uselessly in the cold green harbor off my grandfather's dock, watching Dahlia Voss, 9 years old, laughing 1 second and choking the next, go under for the second time. In the first version of July 19, 2000, I had swum to her without thinking, grabbed her by the collar of her yellow swimsuit, and screamed for my grandfather's groundskeeper, a man named Pete Aldous, who pulled us both out coughing and shaking on the dock while our mothers cried and thanked God. It was, our family always said, the moment that proved how close Vivian and Dahlia were. Blood sisters. Inseparable. I told that story myself, once, at a rehearsal dinner, as proof that Dahlia would never betray me. I remembered all of it, all 34 years, every betrayal, every dollar, the exact temperature of the water the day I died the second time on Route 127. And I decided, treading water in a body that hadn't grown breasts yet, that I would never again mistake blood for loyalty. I did not swim to her immediately. I want to be honest, the way I couldn't be honest with myself for a long time afterward. I watched her go under, and some cold, newly hatched thing in my chest counted the seconds. 4 seconds longer than before. Then the old reflex, or maybe something softer than the thing I'd just become, took over, and I kicked toward her and got a fistful of yellow fabric and screamed for Pete Aldous same as before. He pulled us out. Dahlia lived. But 4 seconds without oxygen at 9 years old is not nothing, and the doctors at Beverly Hospital found what they called mild hypoxic changes on her scans, and my grandfather, terrified and guilty, restructured his entire estate plan that winter to make sure Dahlia would never want for anything, no matter what. I let that happen. I stood at the edge of the dock in a towel, 10 years old, and watched the first domino fall, because I understood something none of the adults around me did. My grandfather's guilt was the most valuable asset in that family, and whoever controlled it would eventually control everything. I did not become a monster overnight. I became something more patient than that. Through elementary school and middle school in Marblehead, I let Dahlia have the piano recitals and the pity and the extra Christmas gifts that came from Grandpa Elias's guilt about the lake. I studied harder than I had the first time, because I remembered which Series 7 material actually mattered and which stocks a girl born in 1990 should be quietly asking her father to buy in 2003 and 2004, Apple, mostly, and a biotech called Gilead that I begged my father, a high school physics teacher named Walter Cole, to put $4,000 of our modest savings into. He thought I was a strange, obsessive child. My mother, Eleanor, thought I was cold. "You used to cry at everything," she told me once, when I was 12 and refused to loan my allowance to Dahlia for a school trip. "Now you just watch." She was right. I watched. I watched Aunt Renata quietly maneuver herself onto the board of Ashford Weave Group as family liaison starting in 2008, a role that came with a salary of $140,000 a year and no clear duties. I watched Uncle Gerald, a mid-level insurance adjuster with a gambling habit nobody in the family would say out loud, start handling informal advisory work for my grandfather's trust once dementia symptoms worsened around 2011. I watched Dahlia, now a striking 20-year-old at Boston University, date a pre-law student named. I felt something curdle in my stomach the first time I heard his name spoken across a Thanksgiving table in 2012, Marcus Kane. I did not warn anyone. I finished my degree in finance at Boston College a year early. I took the underwriting job at Kestrel Mutual again, because I knew that ladder and I knew exactly which manager, a woman named Priya Nair, would fight for my promotions if I gave her reason to. And in the fall of 2018, when Dahlia opened her gallery in the seaport with money gifted from the family trust, money my grandfather's actual attorney, a sharp, unsentimental woman named Miriam Cho, had flagged as an unauthorized early distribution, I did not lend her $40,000. "I can't, Dahlia," I told her over coffee at a shop on Newbury Street, watching her face do the thing it always did when she didn't get what she wanted, a flicker of hurt calibrated exactly to make you feel like the villain. "I'm saving for a house." "You've always had it easier than me," she said. "You know that, right? Grandpa loves you more. He always did, even after everything." "After what?" I asked, already knowing. "After the lake," she said, and looked away first. "I started keeping records that year. Not out of paranoia, out of a very specific, surgical memory of exactly which documents had destroyed me the first time. I hired a private investigator named Frank Delgado, a retired Boston PD financial crimes detective who now ran a two-man shop out of Quincy, and I paid him $6,000 out of my own savings to quietly track the money moving through Ashford Weave Group's family liaison and advisory line items. I told him I was worried about elder financial abuse. That part, at least, was true. By 2021, Frank had a folder of his own, wire transfers from the Ashford Weave operating account to a shell company called Voss Harbor Holdings, LLC, registered in Delaware by a paralegal at a firm where a young associate named Marcus Kane had, conveniently, done his summer clerkship years earlier. I recognized the paperwork before Frank finished explaining it to me. It was the same maneuver, 6 years early and slightly clumsier, because this time Marcus hadn't married into enough patience to wait for my grandfather to be nearly gone. I did not confront anyone. I opened a separate account. I let Miriam Cho, who I quietly retained as my own personal attorney in 2021 under an engagement letter that named no other Ashford relative, start building a parallel paper trail of every unauthorized distribution, every forged signature on documents dated after my grandfather's 2019 dementia diagnosis, every dollar that moved from Ashford Weave Group into Voss Harbor Holdings. My thesis, if you want to call it that, was simple. I would give them enough rope, enough unsupervised access, enough of my own silence, that they would hang themselves on their own greed before I ever had to say a word. Vipers don't need to be killed. You just need to stop feeding them and step back far enough that they turn on each other. The rope ran out in March of 2023. My grandfather, 94 by then, suffered a stroke that finally stripped away whatever remained of his ability to sign anything. Under the terms of the original 1998 trust, the one drafted long before Dahlia's lake accident, the one Miriam Cho had preserved a certified copy of in her own firm's vault. Control of Ashford Weave Group's voting shares reverted automatically to a court-appointed conservator in the absence of a valid amendment. And when Renata and Gerald Voss rushed a 2019 amendment into Suffolk County Probate Court naming Renata as sole trustee, Miriam was ready with something they weren't: a forensic document examiner named Dr. Susan Whitlock, who testified under oath that the notary seal on the 2019 amendment had been issued to a commission that expired 14 months before the document's date. Marcus Kane, who by then had married Dahlia in a wedding at the Colonnade Hotel that cost, according to the vendor invoices Frank Delgado obtained, $340,000, had notarized it himself. He'd let his own commission lapse and forged the renewal date, exactly the kind of arrogant, lazy fraud that had worked for him for years because nobody in my family had ever bothered to check. I watched the hearing from the third row of a Suffolk County courtroom in April 2023, in a grey theory suit, saying nothing, while Judge Alan Reyes read the forensic findings into the record and Renata Voss's face went the color of old newspaper. Your Honor, Renata's attorney tried. The family's intent was always clear. The family's intent, Judge Reyes said, is not a legal standard, Counselor. Fraud is. Ashford Weave Group's board, which had been quietly restless about Renata's undefined role and Gerald's undisclosed gambling debts for 2 years by then, debts that had ballooned, Frank's records showed, to $890,000 across 3 casinos in Connecticut, voted 6-1 to remove her within a month. The one holdout was Gerald himself. Voss Harbor Holdings, its accounts frozen pending the fraud investigation, could no longer cover the mortgage on Dahlia and Marcus's $2.1 million house in Cohasset. Marcus's firm, Bracken & Foyle, opened an internal ethics review the week the notary fraud hit the Boston Globe's business section, and quietly terminated him in June, by mutual agreement, which is a phrase attorneys use when they mean fired. I remembered a scene from my first life, 10 years old on that dock, my grandmother's sapphire ring catching the light on Dahlia's finger at my own funeral reception while she told a room full of mourners that I would have wanted her to have it. I thought about that scene again in August 2023, when I stood outside a modest rental condo in Quincy, the house in Cohasset already gone, sold at a loss to cover legal fees, and watched a moving truck carry out furniture that used to belong, I happened to know, to my grandmother. I felt almost nothing. That, more than any lawsuit, was the proof of what I'd become. The last piece fell into place because of a man named Julian Marsh. I met him in September 2022, before the trust hearing, at a Kestrel Mutual conference in Chicago, where he was the CEO of a mid-sized private equity firm called Marsh Bridgeford Capital. He was 41, precise, unimpressed by wealth he hadn't built himself, and when I mentioned, carefully, in the vaguest possible terms, that my family had a fraud problem tangled up in an old textile trust, he didn't offer sympathy. He offered his firm's forensic accounting team, for a fee, and later, when the fee became irrelevant to him, for free. I don't do charity, he told me once, over dinner at a place on Newbury I'd been too broke to afford in my first life. I do this because you're the only person I've met in a decade who thinks 5 moves ahead instead of 1. By the time the Suffolk probate case resolved in November 2023, Julian's forensic team had also uncovered something Frank Delgado's smaller operation hadn't caught. Marcus, in his final desperate months at Bracken & Foyle, had used privileged information from an unrelated client, a Rhode Island shipbuilding company, to make a $220,000 personal trade through Dahlia's brokerage account, betting on a merger before it was public. Insider trading. Marsh Bridgeford's compliance officer flagged it to the SEC as a matter of routine due diligence, not out of any favor to me. I hadn't even asked him to look. I had simply, patiently, made sure the right forensic eyes were pointed in the right direction, and let the greed already in motion finish the job on its own. Marcus was indicted in January 2024. Dahlia, whose brokerage account the trade ran through, was named in the SEC civil complaint as well, though prosecutors ultimately declined criminal charges against her for lack of intent. It didn't matter. By then her name alone was enough. No gallery in Boston would show her work. Renata and Gerald filed for personal bankruptcy in February, listing debts of $1.4 million against remaining assets of $61,000. My grandfather, lucid on his better days, signed a new directive, drafted properly, by Miriam Cho, witnessed and notarized by someone whose license was actually current, naming me sole successor trustee of Ashford Weave Group, the way it should have been from the beginning. I didn't ask for it. I let the paperwork speak for itself, the way paperwork always eventually does, if you're patient enough to let it. I saw all three of them together only once more, in April 2024, at Miriam Cho's office on State Street, for the final asset settlement hearing. Nobody but the lawyers wanted to attend. Dahlia looked thinner than I remembered, in a coat that used to be Burberry and was starting to fray at the cuffs. Renata's hands shook when she signed. Gerald wouldn't look at anyone. Marcus, out on bail, sat at the far end of the table in a suit that no longer fit him properly, because you lose weight in county holding, apparently, faster than anyone tells you. Vivian, Dahlia said, when the paperwork was done and the room was clearing. Her voice cracked in a way that, in my first life, would have gutted me. Please. We're family. You could have made this easier. You could have. She stopped. You let me almost drown when we were kids, didn't you? I remember. 4 seconds. I've always wondered why it felt longer than it should have. I looked at her for a long moment. I thought about the sapphire ring, the champagne bottle, the manila folder on my kitchen counter, the 11 o'clock road outside Manchester by the sea. You didn't drown, Dahlia, I said. You just finally learned what it feels like to sink and have nobody come. Marcus tried, once, standing too close, his voice dropped low the way it used to be when he wanted something from me. Viv, you know none of this had to happen this way. It's Ms. Ashford, I said, and picked up my briefcase, and did not look back. I sold the Marblehead Lake house in June 2024, not out of bitterness, but because Julian and I were closing on a place in Rockport with a view I actually chose for myself, for once, instead of inheriting. My grandfather died peacefully that August, 95 years old, with me holding his hand instead of anyone's forged signature near it. Ashford Weave Group posted its strongest quarter in a decade that fall, under my direction, with Priya Nair, who I'd hired away from Kestrel Mutual the moment I had the authority to do it, running operations at my side. I think about that 10-year-old girl on the dock sometimes, treading water, deciding in 4 cold seconds that love without leverage is just a story other people tell about you after you're gone. I don't regret what she decided. I only regret that it took drowning twice to learn it. Some people are reborn in fire. I was reborn in salt water, and it turns out that's just as good at burning away everything soft enough to be used against you. If this story of betrayal, rebirth, and quiet, ice-cold revenge kept you hooked, hit like, share it with someone who loves a plot twist, and subscribe for more Reborn drama stories.